Nestled deep in the Himalayan mountains in the north of India, more than a 5-day journey from any human habitation, lies a small, shallow lake, which is frozen for much of the year, but filled with crystal clear water during the summer months. However, this is no ordinary lake. When one gets closer, one is greeted with a stomach-churning sight. The lake is filled with hundreds of human skeletons, almost perfectly preserved by the freezing conditions. Analysis has shown that these skeletons belong to people from different parts of the globe, with some of them being over 1,000 years old. So, who were these people? Why did they travel to this remote area, and what happened to them? Was this a scene of an ancient battle? A mass burial site? Or were these people the victims of something much, much more terrifying? Modern science has been grappling with these questions for many decades, and some incredible findings about these skeletons over recent years have left researchers dumbfounded, making this site one of the most bizarre, unsolved mysteries anywhere in the world. The Himalayan mountain range is one of the largest in the world, stretching across 595,000 square kilometers. And 6 countries, India, China, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bhutan. In the heart of this grand range, in the Indian state of Uttarakhand, and not far off the border with Nepal, lies Roopkund Lake, a small glacial lake that is around 40 meters in diameter and no more than a few meters deep. This ordinary lake, which is located in one of the most isolated regions in the world, at an eye-watering elevation of more than 5,000 meters, is quite unimpressive at first glance. But back in 1942, H.K. Madhwal, an Indian forest official working in what was British India at the time, discovered something bone-chilling when he walked up to the lake. Through the shallow water, Madhwal could see hundreds of human skeletal remains spread across the lake bed. To witness this in the middle of nowhere must have been a terrifying sight for Madhwal. But once he and the British colonial officers he reported to got over their initial shock, they decided to study the remains to see what they could find out. What the British discovered left them perplexed and extremely concerned. It was estimated that this lake contained the skeletal remains of between 300 and 800 different individuals. Mysteriously, some of these skulls had a strange grooving across their forehead, which could not be explained, while others had evidence of blunt force trauma on the top of the head. The British were fearful of what this could mean, as they, and by extension India, were in the midst of World War II at the time. There were major concerns about a possible Japanese invasion of India from the north, and many officials felt these remains were evidence that an invasion force had been at this location. However, when the samples were radiocarbon dated, which was a brand new technology at the time, the results immediately ruled out the possibility of a Japanese invasion force, as it was estimated that some of these skeletons were at least 500 years old. So whatever tragic episode happened in this remote corner of the Himalayas was not recent. Could Roopkund Lake have been the scene of a fierce ancient battle between 2 rival armies? Once again, the evidence suggested otherwise. Among the hundreds of skeletons discovered, many belong to females, which is not something one would expect if this was a battlefield. Additionally, many of the people who perished at this lake were wearing leather sandals and bangles, which proves that these were not soldiers. More importantly, only one weapon has ever been discovered at this lake: a solitary spearhead. Besides, why would anyone fight a battle in this remote, inhospitable location, 5,000 meters above sea level? There is no record of any armed conflict here, and no historic trade route passes by this region either. As the puzzle deepened, many theories were put forward to explain these skeletons, including the idea that this was a scene of a mass ritualistic suicide. Is it possible that hundreds of people made their way up to this remote lake to take their own lives as part of some ancient ceremony? Some even floated the possibility that this could just be a mass burial site, with the remains belonging to victims of a long-forgotten pandemic. However, the evidence for this theory was not strong either. By studying the remains, it was deduced that the owners of these skeletons were in perfectly good health when they passed away, thus discrediting the pandemic theory, while the injuries to the top of the skull were not consistent with what you would expect in a mass suicide. For many decades, the researchers were left with more questions than answers, as there was no plausible explanation for why so many people ended up perishing in this icy Himalayan lake. But then a big breakthrough arrived, not in the form of scientific evidence, but from a local folktale in the region. To find out how these people died, researchers first tried to answer the question of why hundreds of people made their way up to Roopkund Lake in the first place. And there was only one answer to that question. The area around the lake is a 5-day trek away from human habitation, but it is right in the middle of one of the most ancient and dangerous pilgrimages in India, Nanda Devi Rajjat Yatra, a once-in-12-year Hindu tradition that continues in the area till today. This 19-day pilgrimage honors the goddess Nanda Devi, who, according to the locals, brings prosperity and blessings to the region. During the event, hundreds of pilgrims wearing bangles and leather slippers pass right by this lake. Additionally, these pilgrims are usually accompanied by porters, who carry a heavy load using a tumpline, which is a strap that goes across the forehead. We know that prolonged use of tumplines causes a grooving across the skull, just like the ones we found on the skeletons at Roopkund Lake. So we can conclude with relative certainty that the people who met their tragic fate in this lake were pilgrims, but we still do not know what killed them. Astonishingly, it turns out that a local legend, which has been retold orally through songs for hundreds of years in this region, may provide a big clue to what happened here. This song tells the tale of a local king who made the pilgrimage to honor Nanda Devi, but failed to show respect to the goddess and decided to bring concubines and dancing girls along with him for the journey. Nanda Devi was not best pleased with the opulence on show, and she decided to teach the king and his traveling party a harsh lesson. The story goes that she struck down the pilgrims with hailstones as hard as iron, which fell from the sky in the thousands, bludgeoning the king and his entire crew to death near Roopkund Lake. What makes this story remarkable is that it is an unbelievable fit for the evidence which has been gathered so far. The area around Roopkund Lake is no stranger to extreme weather events and is prone to severe hailstorms, which occasionally bring with them falling ice chunks as big as tennis balls. Moreover, this is an extremely exposed area with no high vegetation to offer protection from the falling ice. The obvious conclusion that one reaches is that these skeletons belonged to pilgrims who found themselves caught in a colossal storm and were battered to death by pieces of frozen ice that rained down on them. This explains the evidence of blunt force trauma discovered on the top of the skulls found in the lake. Experts think that the legend of Nanda Devi's punishment to the king grew out of the eyewitness accounts of those who survived the real incident that occurred near this lake many centuries ago. So, after many decades, it seemed like the mystery of the Roopkund Lake skeletons had finally been solved. But there would be one more plot twist, which would blow the hailstorm theory completely out of the water. In 2019, a new group of researchers decided to re-examine the skeletons to see what they could find. These remains had first been carbon dated in the 1950s, when the technology was still very new. Researchers studying the bones in 2019 could date them far more accurately. And what they discovered flew in the face of everything we thought we knew about these remains. It was discovered that these skeletons were not all deposited in one event, but rather in multiple distinct ones. The oldest remains at Roopkund Lake were dated to around 800 AD, while a different group of remains was dated to the early 19th century, which means that there was more than a 1,000-year gap between these incidents. Even more astoundingly, the two sets of remains belonged to completely distinct genetic groups. The skeletons from the 800 AD period belonged to South Asians, which is not surprising given that Roopkund Lake is in India. But the remains from the early 19th century were found to match the current-day population of Greece, more specifically, the Greek island of Crete. This was a mind-blowing discovery and raised several puzzling questions. What were people from the Mediterranean doing in a remote corner of North India in the 19th century? It is unlikely they took part in the Nanda Devi pilgrimage, and if they were tourists, they certainly found themselves in a very odd place. Besides, One would think that if hundreds of travelers from Crete had ended up in the middle of the Himalayas around 200 years ago, that would have been big news at the time. But despite an extensive search, there is absolutely no record of any traveling party from that region ever making it to this part of India during that time period. Just when people thought the story could not get any more confusing, there were even bigger twists around the corner. Among the group that died in the 18th century, one set of remains belonged not to someone from Crete or India, but rather to a person of Southeast Asian heritage. What could have brought someone from Southeast Asia to this part of the Himalayas? And why was he accompanying hundreds of people from Greece to this location? The mystery deepened even further when it was discovered that the people who were part of the first group, who perished sometime around 800 AD, did not all fall prey to the same incident. We now have evidence that these bones were deposited as a result of 3 or 4 different incidents, some of which happened hundreds of years apart. These recent findings have brought us right back to square one, as no one can explain why people from different parts of the world made their way to this part of the Himalayas at different periods and ended up perishing in the exact same lake. While it is plausible that one group of travelers was struck down by a hailstorm, it is simply not realistic to suggest that several different groups of travelers across a 1,000-year period were all coincidentally struck down by frozen ice chunks in the exact same location. Many conspiracy theories have been making the rounds on the internet over recent years about these skeletons and the mystery surrounding them, but the truth is that we do not have a clear theory that explains all the gathered evidence. We know that something truly awful happened in this secluded lake across a 1,000-year span, but we simply do not know what it was. And the unfortunate part is that we might never find out, because over recent years, this lake has become a popular tourist spot, and the tourists often tamper with the evidence by rearranging the bones in different places. Once the bones are taken away from the original resting place and placed elsewhere artificially, it becomes extremely difficult for researchers to piece together exactly how these victims met their fate. A lot of this damage cannot be undone, and unless immediate steps are taken to protect this area and the remains, we might never actually get to the bottom of how and why these unfortunate souls met their demise in one of the remotest and coldest areas in the world, thousands of kilometers away from their homeland. These hundreds of unsuspecting people who perished in these icy waters in the middle of the Himalayas deserve to have their stories told, which is why archaeological work will continue over the coming years and decades as we try to put the mystery of the Roopkund Lake skeletons to bed once and for all. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. And if you want to learn more about such unique places and phenomena, subscribe to the channel. We will continue bringing you stories and ideas that blow your mind, as the truth, as they say, is stranger than fiction.